Hello everyone, this is number 2 of our Flow Along series where I build simple flows and you follow along. In the previous video, we created a very basic record trigger flow and we learned about the flow star element and entry criteria. In this video, we're going to take a step up and look at the decision elements within a flow. So let's begin by explaining what a decision element is and why you would use one. A decision element in a flow allows you to take different actions based on specific criteria. So in the last video where we talked about the entry criteria, we made it so our flow would only trigger if the lead was created and the lead source was web. Now, if that criteria was not met, the only other possible outcome would be that the flow wouldn't trigger. Therefore, no automation would happen. With a decision, however, we can change the other possible outcome to something else. So let's talk about the use case, and then we'll jump into the flow builder and start making some changes. I've created a new diagram here so that we can go over the use case. You see that these diagrams are in extremely simple terms. Realistically, they would be built differently, but I try to keep things really simple just to make it easier for us. And so I thought this would be a good approach. Now, I've replicated the original diagram that we had, and then I added some changes to it. So our use case is very straightforward. I'm just going to make this full screen here. So our use case is when a lead record is created, we want to check the lead source. Now, if it's web, we want to update the rating to hot, just like we did in the last video. However, if the lead source is phone inquiry, then we want to update the rating to warm. Now, this does leave a few other possibilities. So we will have to make some changes. First of all, we want to change the entry criteria of our flow. Because if we use the same entry criteria as before, our flow is never going to run when the lead source is anything other than web. And we also need to accommodate for a third and possible outcome, which is what if the lead source is not web or phone inquiry? Because as we know, there are more than 2 values in the lead source picklist field. So let's jump into Salesforce and then we'll go through the flow builder together. So as you know, this is a build along tutorial. So by now you should have your Trailhead Playground open on one screen and then the video open on another, and feel free to pause and follow along. So we're going to jump into Salesforce here and we're going to go into setup, and then we're going to search for flows in the quick find. So far, these are exactly the same steps we did in the last video. Then what we're going to do when this page loads is we're going to look for a flow. Now, our naming convention for our flows is that it begins with the object name. And so here we can start looking for lead. And here it is, lead, before save, lead source web. So I'm just going to click on that flow name, and that's going to open the flow builder for me. Now, while this is loading, if you're watching this video and you're completely lost, it might be because you've missed the first video. So this is a continuation of the first video. If you haven't watched that, I highly recommend you watch that first and then come back to this video. Okay, so here is our flow from the previous video. We have an entry criteria, and then we have an update element that's updating that lead record for us. So if we look at our entry criteria, our flow is only going to trigger when the lead source equals web. And we can see that right here. In addition to that, it's only going to trigger when the record is created, but we already knew that. So in order to satisfy our new use case, which is this over here, when a lead is created, we want to check for web or phone inquiry, and then update, if it's web, update rating to hot, and if it's phone inquiry, update rating to warm. Then we need to make some changes. Now, if our use case was slightly different, so if our use case was when a lead record is created and the lead source is web or phone inquiry, then change the lead rating to hot, we could simply just add another value here. We could simply just add lead source here and then here we can say phone inquiry, and then we would be able to change the condition requirements to, instead of being and, we change it to or. And that way, what we would be saying is when a lead record is created and lead source equals web or lead source equals phone inquiry, then trigger the flow and the next element would update the lead rating to hot. However, that's not our use case. Our use case is when a lead record is created, check for the lead source. If it's web, do one thing. If it's phone inquiry, do something else. And if it's not web or phone inquiry, then do something else entirely. And therefore, we have to change our entry criteria so that the flow can trigger to accommodate all of these different possible scenarios. So what we need to do is we need to get rid of that criteria. And where we have lead source field, instead of having an operator of equals, we want to use the operator of is null. So if you recall, in the last video, I told you that an easy way of looking at is null is just thinking of, is it empty? So what we're asking here is the lead source field empty? In other words, when a lead record is created and the lead source field is empty, is false, that means it's not empty, then trigger our flow. So I'm going to go through that again. When a lead record is created, that's our trigger. Then check for the entry conditions. Is the lead source empty? Yes or no? If the lead source is not empty, trigger the flow. If the lead source is empty, don't trigger the flow. That's what we're doing. And the reason for that is because our decision is going to check the lead source value. And then it's going to do what we want it to do. So if there is no value, there is no point in running the flow because there is nothing to work with. And remember what I said in the first video, you want to make sure that your entry criteria are correct because you don't want this flow to run when it's not necessary. That can cause all kinds of issues. And frankly, it's very far from best practice. And we definitely want to start learning about these best practices so that we can start accommodating for them and using them as we carry our work. So now we have our entry criteria. What we need to do next is actually add the decision element. So to add the element, you can click on this add element plus icon, and that will bring up that add element table again, where you can select from a variety of different elements. Now, before we do that, it's worth noting that we want to do that right after the entry element, right after the start of the flow, not after the update record element, but before. Okay, so here's our update record element. We want to do it before that. So here I'm going to search for decision, and you can see there's an element called decision. And of course, the first thing we need to do is give it a label. So we're going to call this check for lead source. And then for the API, I like to put a DES naming convention prefix beforehand. That's just the way that I like to do my naming conventions and flows. You're more than welcome to follow this, but you don't have to. So we've given the actual element a name. And now what we need to do is we need to give the outcome a name as well. So you can see here on the left, we have an outcome order. We have a plus icon where we can add more outcomes. And then within that outcome page, we have a delete outcome in case we added too many. And then we have some fields that we have to populate. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a new outcome and we're going to give this one a name. We're going to call this web because this decision element is going to check the lead source. So if the value equals web, then we're going to do something. And you can see on the actual canvas here, as I populated that label, that populated this diagram for me as well, which is really helpful. So if the lead source equals web, now I have to actually give that resource. I have to give the condition. I can't just type in text. The flow won't know what this means. This is just a label. To the flow, this means nothing. So I have to actually tell the flow what should happen for the lead source to equal web. And we can do that. So if you click on the resource, and then if you scroll down, you can see that there is an option here that says triggering lead. This is the lead record that triggered the flow. And then when you click there, you have access to the record and all the fields within the record. So now we can search for lead source, and then the operator should be equals and the value should be web. So now we've given this decision outcome an actual condition to execute this outcome. So what we're saying here is, if this condition is met, then execute this outcome. And the condition is, if the lead record, lead source field equals web, execute this outcome that we've labeled web. So now we want to do the same thing, but for a lead source value of phone inquiry. So what I recommend you do is pause the video, try to create this new outcome by yourself, and then resume the video and see if we have the same result. So I'm going to go ahead and create this new value. I'm going to call this phone inquiry. The reason for this is because I want to keep the same naming convention. So I've called the first one web. I'm going to call the second one phone inquiry. On resource, I'm going to scroll down and look for triggering lead to get to the lead record that triggered our flow. Then I'm going to search for lead source. Now here I want to make sure my operator is equals, and then for value, I want to select phone inquiry. So now I've given this condition an actual requirement to execute if it becomes true. The last thing I want to do is, if we click on the default outcome, we can see that the default outcome accommodates for all the other scenarios. So this is in order. So first, the decision is going to check if the lead source equals web. If it does, it's going to execute this outcome. If it doesn't, it's going to then go to the next one and check, does lead source equal phone inquiry? If it does, it's going to execute that. If it doesn't, it's then going to go to the default outcome. You can leave default outcome as is, or you can relabel this if you want to. We're going to leave it as is because we're trying to keep it as simple as possible. So now we can get rid of this. And now that we have our decision outcomes set up, we need to actually tell the flow what to do if that outcome is executed. And so we already had an update lead rating element for web. If we go into that, we can see that this updates the lead rating to hot. So if the lead source equals web, the rating is hot. We can still use this. It's just in the wrong place at the moment. Right now, as you can see, it's after our decision, and we need to put it inside our decision. So to do that, we can click on this element, and this little box opens up, and you can just cut the element. It's like copy, cut, paste. It's the same thing, but you're doing it to an element now within a flow. So it's really helpful. So we can cut this element, and now it's asking us, where do we want to paste this element? And we want to paste it on the web outcome branch of our decision. So now you can see that this update element is within our decision branch of web. And what we want to do now is we want to create a new update record for when the decision outcome is phone inquiry. Now, we could just create a new one by clicking the plus icon, finding the update element, which is this one here, update records, and then filling out the information. But another thing that we can do is we can take the existing one, and instead of cutting, we can copy. That way we can duplicate this one, and we can paste it under the phone inquiry. You see here it says paste one element, so we can paste that here. And now you can see the label says copy one of update lead rating. So we need to change this. So we need to go into that element, and we need to update the naming convention. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do update lead rating to warm, and then we're going to get rid of the API name, and we're just going to generate that new API name. So lead rating to warm, And now what we want to do is on the fields that's updating, it's got the right field, but the wrong value. So we want to take off hot and we want to add warm. Now this should be good to go now. What we do want to do, however, is fix the naming convention of the other one, because now we have two. It makes sense for us to call this update lead rating to hot. And I'm going to change the API name as well so that they're both the same. So this makes it a little bit more tidy. And remember, it's always good to stay tidy when you're creating a flow, because flows can get really big and really complex really quickly. And if you don't adopt these naming conventions and tidy approach in the beginning, you find yourself regretting it later on. So let's have a review of what we've just done. If we go back to the start element, our flow is now triggering when a lead record is created and the lead source is not empty. Okay. Then we have a decision. This decision is checking the lead source value. If it's web, go to the web branch and execute the web outcome. And if it's phone inquiry, then go to the phone inquiry branch and execute the phone inquiry outcome. And if it's not web or phone inquiry, then go down the default outcome. Okay, so far so good. Now we have these three branches: web, phone inquiry, and default outcome. So if it is web, we're updating the lead record. We're taking the rating and setting it to hot. Okay, that's what we were doing in the last video. So far so good. However, now if it's phone inquiry, we're taking that same lead record and we're updating the rating field, this time to warm. Okay. Now, if it's not web or phone inquiry, what are we doing? What are we doing in this branch here? If you ever need to recap, just follow the line. It's that easy. Here's the decision element. If it's web, then we have an update element that puts the lead rating to hot. And then if you continue following the line, it then ends. If it's phone inquiry, there is an update element that updates the lead rating to warm. And then you keep following the line and it ends. And if it's default outcome, you follow the default outcome line. There is nothing there, so nothing will happen. It's going to keep following the line and then it's going to end. And that's it. If you need an easier way to visualize this, what you can do is you can click the add element after the update records, and there is an end element here as well. Now watch how this is going to change this diagram for us. You see how it changed? Now I'm going to do the same for phone inquiry, and look at that. So if you prefer, if this is easier for you to visualize, then let's do it this way. You just have to follow the line. You start the flow, you follow the line, you get to a check for lead source decision element. That's what we're learning in this video. If the value is web, we update the lead rating to hot and then it ends. If it's phone inquiry, we update the lead rating to warm and then it ends. And if it's default, it just ends. That's it. Now, because we're not doing anything if it's not web or phone inquiry, we could add in our start element to only trigger if it's web or phone inquiry. And that way, we can add the decision and then do different things. Because at the moment, if it's not phone inquiry, it's just going to go through the decision and then it's going to end. But the flow will still run. The flow wouldn't have done anything. It wouldn't have automated anything, but it's still going to trigger. And so that's not very good. We want to minimize that as much as possible. So what we're going to do instead is we're just going to add a new update element. And that way we can capture for all of the other values. So I'm going to copy this element again, and I'm going to paste it on the default outcome. I'm going to change the label again to update lead rating to cold. And then I'm going to change the rating value from warm to cold. And that way, we are capturing all of the possible outcomes. So if it's web, it's hot. If it's phone inquiry, it's warm. If it's anything else, then it's cold. And now our trigger is correct and our decisions are capturing all of the possible field values for that pick list field. So the next thing we need to do is we need to click Save As. Now, as soon as we save as, you have this window where you can change the name, you can change the description. We should probably do this. So lead source, it's not web anymore because we're not just doing it for web. So I'm going to call this updates. And then for the description, I'm going to change this slightly. So this flow is triggered when a lead record is created and the lead source equals web. I'm going to change this, web or phone inquiry. It then updates the rating to hot or warm. If the lead source value is anything else, the rating becomes cold. So this is just a nice and easy description of what that flow is doing. It's as simple as that. You can put whatever you want here as long as you describe what the flow is doing in your own words. When you're ready, you can hit save. Now that we're saving it, we're going to take the same approach and we're going to activate it. Now, the reason we're activating the flow like this without debugging it is because this is a training scenario and we are in a playground. You would not want to do this in a real life scenario. You'd want to debug it before you activate it, and you absolutely would never do this directly in a production environment. So just keep that in mind. This is a training environment, and that's why we're taking this approach. So what we want to do next is go back to the front end. We want to go to a lead record, and we want to start creating some new lead records. So let's create the first lead record. We're going to call this test lead. We're on lead 3 now. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add the lead source to web first. And notice the rating is just going to be blank. I'm going to hit save. And now our rating is showing as hot. Great. That's perfect. That's exactly what we want. So I'm going to create a new lead now. Test lead 4. And our rating is going to be phone inquiry. Sorry, our lead source is going to be phone inquiry and our rating is going to be none. I'm going to hit save. And if we go to our record, our rating is set to warm. So far, so good. I'm going to go back to leads. I'm going to create a new one. Test lead 5. And our lead source now is going to be anything other than web or phone inquiry. So I'm going to put partner referral. And our rating is going to be none. And I'm going to hit save. If I go to details, we can see our rating is now cold. So this seems to be working just fine. Now, ideally, what you would want to do is create more lead records and test all of the other values as well to make sure that they equal cold. And that way, you know everything is working. What I'm going to do is create a new record. And instead of selecting other values, I'm just not going to populate the lead source field. And what should happen is our flow should not trigger, which means the rating should remain empty. So let's see if that's the case. I'm going to hit save. I'll click on details and rating is still empty. In other words, our flow did not trigger. So what we've learned is that we can change the entry criteria of our flow, and then we can use a decision element to accommodate for different possible outcomes. So without a decision element, your flow either triggers or it won't trigger. And there is no other possible outcome. It's either triggered or it's not. With a decision element, however, you can modify your entry criteria so your flow is triggered with less criteria being met, and then you can add a decision element to accommodate for various different outcomes based on your conditions for your decision. If that condition for that decision is met, then that decision outcome is executed, and whatever is within that branch gets triggered. For example, the value of rating is updated to a specific value. if that decision outcome is not met, then it's not executed, and it works in order. So it checks for one. If it's not executed, it checks for the other. If it's not executed, it checks for the other until you've run out of decision outcomes, and then it follows the default decision outcome. A decision always has a default outcome, and that way it can accommodate for any possible outcome. I hope you like this video. Stay tuned for the next video where we dive yet again deeper into record trigger flows. See you next time.